Hello everyone, and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Here is the complete rewrite with all improvements applied. Nick was the kind of person most people forgot about on purpose. Not because he was invisible, but because remembering him meant acknowledging that some people simply fall through every crack life offers and keep falling. He dropped out of school in 9th grade, not dramatically, not with some story attached to it, but quietly, the way a stone slips off the edge of a table when no one is watching. After that, he moved, town to town, job to job, never long enough anywhere to leave a mark or make a real enemy, though he made plenty of small ones along the way. By the time everything happened, he had settled into the kind of life that people don't ask too many questions about. He did favors. He ran errands that didn't have names. He existed in the gray spaces between things. And he had learned, over years of surviving there, that other people were tools as much as they were human beings. I didn't know Nick personally. I knew of him the way you know of weather systems in other states. You hear about them. You understand they exist and that they cause damage, but they don't feel real until they arrive on your doorstep. Elena was the one who felt real. She had gone to high school with my husband, and she was one of those people who seemed to carry friendship naturally, without effort. When she visited us in 2003, we were both still in college, still soft around the edges, still believing that the people we let into our homes were more or less who they appeared to be. She laughed easily. She brought up old memories with my husband, and he lit up telling them back to her. She sat at our table and ate food I cooked and helped with the dishes afterward without being asked. There was nothing cold about her, nothing that snagged. She was warm in the specific way that makes you lower your guard without even noticing you had one. I think about that now more than I probably should. Jack was also someone my husband had grown up with. He was the kind of friend who was always getting tangled in things slightly bigger than himself. Not out of stupidity exactly, but out of a particular kind of recklessness that comes from believing things will probably work out. He had gotten involved in dealing marijuana, and it wasn't a casual hobby. He was running pickups for Native Americans in northern New York, and it was organized enough, serious enough, that when the police pulled him over one afternoon and found what was in his car, he didn't have much room to talk his way out of anything. They searched the car. They found everything they needed. He was arrested and ended up spending 6 months in jail. Those 6 months did something to the structure of his life that couldn't simply be put back together once he was out. He had a debt before he went in. That debt didn't pause while he served his time. The people he owed didn't operate on a system of grace or understanding. They had given him product, he had lost it, and the money they were owed was still owed. 6 months in a cell didn't change that arithmetic. When he got out, Jack was free in the technical sense, but what surrounded him was tighter than any cell. He owed money he didn't have, to people who had already begun looking for him, and every conversation he had with the few people he trusted had that undercurrent running through it. The debt, the pressure, what to do next. He talked to the people closest to him, which is what a person does when they're scared. You go back to the familiar. You go back to the faces that have known you long enough to feel safe. Jack trusted Nick and Elena in the way you trust people before they give you a reason not to. It wasn't naivety exactly. It was just the ordinary, devastating assumption that the people who have shared your company have some basic investment in your survival. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Nick and Elena were having their own conversations. At some point, in some room he wasn't in, they had arrived at an idea. It wasn't impulsive. Why, that's the part that is hardest to sit with. They had thought about it enough to shape it into a plan, to assign roles, to make decisions about timing and location. They had convinced themselves that if they delivered Jack to the reservation, they could take his place. They could become the suppliers. They could step into the slot his absence would create, and come out of it not just debt-free, but ahead. What they were planning to do to another human being was, in their calculation, a business decision, a transaction, a way through. They invited him to Alina's house. The invitation was casual, the way all the worst invitations are. Just coming over, hanging out. The kind of thing that doesn't raise a flag because it has happened 100 times before and been nothing. Jack showed up the way you show up to something that feels like routine, without armor, without suspicion. Alina was waiting behind bushes near the house. This is the detail that I keep coming back to, that she had positioned herself there ahead of time, that she had crouched in the dark with a rock in her hand and waited for someone who believed he was just visiting a friend. When Jack came around to the side of the house, she stepped out and hit him on the back of the head. Not a warning blow, not something that was ever going to stop at one strike and a conversation. He went down hard, and the ground came up to meet him before he understood what was happening. They tied him while he was unconscious. They moved with the efficiency of people who had already rehearsed it in their minds. They put him in the trunk of his own car and closed it. And then they got in and started driving toward New York. When Jack came back to consciousness, it was to darkness and motion and the smell of the trunk, and the understanding arriving slowly, horribly, that he was locked inside his own vehicle. He banged on the metal. He called out. The road noise swallowed everything. At some point they stopped at a rest stop. Jack heard them outside the car, and he started talking through the trunk. He was rational, which is a remarkable thing when you consider what rational means in that situation. He said he needed to use the bathroom. He said he wouldn't run. He made his voice as calm as he could and asked for something small and human. The basic dignity of not soiling himself. The illusion of normalcy. Maybe he thought if he seemed cooperative, they would relax. Maybe he was thinking past the rest stop to whatever came next and trying to buy himself a margin. Maybe he was simply telling the truth and really needed to go. It doesn't matter what he was thinking. It matters that they opened the trunk. The moment his feet were on the ground, he ran. Of course he ran. There was no version of that moment where a person with any survival instinct did anything else. He ran because the trunk had been one kind of death, and standing there obediently was another kind. And at least running was movement, was possibility, was the slim chance that something could still go differently. Nick shot him in the back. There was no warning. There was no moment where Nick called out for him to stop, or tried to close the distance first, or made any calculation beyond the one that ended Jack's life. He pulled the gun and fired, and Jack went down near a creek in Stafford, New York. They didn't check for a pulse. They didn't call anyone. They didn't stand there for long. They left him in the mud near the water, and they got back in the car. What came next was the careful, cold work of people trying to erase a story. They took Jack's wallet. They took the rope. They took his clothes, stripping away anything that could connect to identity or method. They drove to Rochester and dumped those things in a dumpster, distributed the evidence across the ordinary garbage of a city, and then they drove Jack's car to Chicopee, Massachusetts. They set it on fire. The car that had been his, that had carried him in its trunk, that had been present for all of it. It was burned to its frame in a parking lot or on a roadside, and they walked away from the flames the same way they had walked away from him. There was something happening in the weeks before all of this that added a layer of dread to the whole story, a sense that things had already begun closing in around Jack before that final night. Native Americans from the reservation had come down to the Chester area looking for him. They had gone door to door. They had knocked on the homes of people who knew him or might have known him. asking questions in the flat, patient way of people who were not going to stop asking. At one point, they came to the home of my sister-in-law and her husband, who was known to be involved in things himself. Just the image of those men at the door, asking where Jack was, the calm persistence of it, the suggestion that his debt had a face and that face was now standing on someone's front step, made the whole situation feel like a net that had already been pulled tight. Jack was being looked for from more than one direction. He just didn't know it yet. Nick eventually talked. When the legal proceedings came, he gave his version, and his version placed Alina at the beginning and at the end, but not at the precise center. He said she hit Jack with the rock. He said she helped get him into the trunk. He said he called her later, after, to help set the car on fire. But he claimed she wasn't there at the creek. She wasn't there when Jack ran and was shot. Whether this was the truth or a version of the truth, shaped by whatever calculations Nick was making in a courtroom, no one can say with complete certainty. What it did was create a sliver of legal distance between Alina and the moment the gun went off. A sliver, not an absolution. Alina disappeared after all of it, not dramatically, not in any way that drew attention. She simply stopped being present in the lives of the people who had known her. No one seemed to have a clear picture of where she went or what her life became. She carried whatever she carried and went somewhere else, and the world closed over the space she had occupied, the way water closes over a stone. That erasure, that quiet vanishing, was its own kind of unsettling. A person who laughed at your table, who helped with your dishes, who seemed warm in all the ordinary ways, had helped plan and execute the kidnapping and death of someone who trusted her, and then she simply became someone else's background. The version of the story my husband first heard was the word-of-mouth version, the one that passed through people who were scared and piecing things together from fragments. That version had its own shape, slightly different from what came out in court. Some things were larger in that version, some smaller. Fear does that to a story. It fills in the gaps with the worst possible explanations, because the worst possible explanations are the ones the body already suspects. By the time the official record emerged, shaped by testimony and evidence and legal argument, some of the details had shifted. But the structure held. It always held. What I am left with is not the violence itself, though the violence is there and I won't pretend it isn't. What I am left with is the before. The version of Alina sitting at our table in 2003, easy and warm, with no visible seam between who she appeared to be and who she was capable of becoming. The understanding that she was already herself when she was with us. That the person who crouched behind the bushes with a rock was present in the same body that laughed at something my husband said. I don't know how to reconcile those two things. I'm not sure I'm supposed to be able to. The most frightening thing about this story is not the gun or the trunk or the fire. It's the visit, it's the dishes. It's the ease of someone who could sit in your kitchen and seem entirely, convincingly human, while something else was already waiting inside them, patient and invisible, for the right conditions to emerge. That's what doesn't leave you. Not the monster. The friend. I grew up in a pretty ordinary hometown, the kind of place where most people either knew each other or at least recognized the important faces. It wasn't a city where anonymity protected you or where danger felt built into the landscape. It was smaller than that, more familiar. News traveled quickly. Stories attached themselves to people and stayed there for years. Everybody seemed to know who had divorced who got arrested, whose kid made the honor roll, who bought a new truck, who had cancer, who had come back from college. It was the kind of place where people believed they understood the boundaries of what could happen there. If something truly shocking ever occurred, surely everyone would know about it right away. Surely the town itself would somehow prevent it from becoming too strange. That was what I believed, anyway. There was a kid I knew from high school who was 1 grade younger than me. I didn't know him well. We weren't friends. We didn't hang out together, and we were not part of the same social circle. But in a town like ours, that didn't matter much. You still knew who people were. You knew their family name, where they lived, what sports they played, whether they got into trouble, whether adults liked them. He lived on the same street as my aunt and uncle, so I had heard his name more than once outside school, too. And years before everything happened, he had become one of those small-town stories people kept repeating because it made them feel good about the world. When he was younger, he had saved his father from drowning. His father had a heart attack while he was in the water, and this kid, somehow, they had the presence of mind to pull him out and keep him alive until help arrived. That was the story, and it was told the same way every time, with admiration, with that particular tone adults use when they want a child's bravery to stand for something bigger than one moment. Firefighters honored him. Police honored him. There was a banquet. He got awards. His picture was in the paper. For a while, he wasn't just another local kid. He was proof, people said, that good kids still existed. He was brave, selfless, strong under pressure. The kind of boy people pointed to when they wanted to feel hopeful. That story followed him for years. Teachers mentioned it. Parents used him as an example. People spoke about him as though that one act had revealed something permanent about his character, something settled and reliable. No one ever talked about him in a negative way. If anything, adults seemed proud that he came from our town. He was part of the local mythology in a small way. Not famous exactly, but marked by a kind of borrowed goodness that stuck to him because everyone wanted it to be true. That is one of the reasons everything that came later felt unreal. Not unreal because it was impossible, but unreal because it refused the story everyone had already agreed on. We like to believe the people around us make sense. We like them to stay inside the shape we first assigned them. Hero, troubled kid, good family, bad house, smart girl, nice teacher. Once those labels settle, they become stronger than evidence. That town had decided who he was, and we all lived inside that decision without knowing it. The first time I heard about the murders, I didn't connect them to him at all. An older couple had been found dead a few blocks from my aunt and uncle's house. They were well known in the area. The husband had worked in the legal system for years, either as a judge or a district attorney. I can't remember exactly which now, but I remember that his profession became the first explanation people reached for. It made sense to everyone immediately. A man in that line of work makes enemies. He locks people up. He touches the lives of dangerous men. If he and his wife were murdered in their own home, then the obvious answer was revenge. And because it was obvious, people accepted it. The town settled into that theory quickly, almost gratefully. Former inmate, old grudge, someone he had sent to prison, some ugly piece of unfinished business finally coming back. It fit the logic people were comfortable with. It preserved the moral geometry they needed. The evil came from outside. The danger belonged somewhere else and had only briefly crossed into our streets because of his past life. That was a story people knew how to hold. Even before the truth came out, the details were disturbing. The couple had gone out to a family dinner that evening. While they were away, someone broke into their house. That part alone was enough to frighten people. But the part that lodged in me more deeply was what happened next. He didn't steal a few things and run. He didn't smash anything in anger and disappear. He stayed. He hid in a closet and waited. That detail still makes my skin crawl. There is something uniquely terrible about waiting inside another person's home, about standing in the dark among their clothes, hearing the house settle around you, knowing they will return any minute and walk through rooms they still believe belong only to them. It turns the entire home against them. Every lamp, every hallway, every door becomes part of the trap without their knowing it. Even now, when I think about closets at night, I sometimes remember that detail first. When the couple got home, they went to bed. They had no idea someone was already inside their house. That is the part that makes it feel unbearable. They moved through their own rooms with total trust. Maybe they locked up. Maybe they spoke to each other in the kitchen. Maybe one of them set something on the counter for the morning. Maybe they talked about the family dinner or complained about being tired. Ordinary things. Final ordinary things. Then, sometime in the night, they were stabbed to death in their sleep. No confrontation, no chance to defend themselves, no warning. It was fast, brutal, and deeply personal in a way that did not fit robbery at all. But for a while, the town kept returning to revenge because revenge was easier to believe than the truth waiting underneath it. People whispered at grocery stores, they talked in driveways, they lowered their voices when children walked by. But all of those conversations stayed inside the same basic frame. Someone from the husband's past must have done this. Someone dangerous, someone far away until now. The town tried to protect itself with explanation. Then, about a week after the murder, something happened that I still think about more than almost any other single moment from that time. I was skipping class that day. I don't even remember the reason. Maybe I wanted to leave early. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I had convinced myself one missed class did not matter. Whatever the reason, I was walking down one of the school hallways at a time when I should have been somewhere else. The building had that strange in-between feeling schools get during class periods, half empty and oddly loud at the same time. The fluorescent lights hummed. Locker doors echoed from far away. The place felt ordinary in the bland institutional way schools always do. Then I turned a corner and stopped. He was there, the kid from my hometown, the hero kid, the one from the newspaper story everybody still remembered. He was standing in front of a row of lockers, punching them over and over again. At first, I couldn't even process what I was seeing because it was so far outside the image I had of him. His hands were red. He kept slamming them into the metal doors as if he were trying to break through to something on the other side. He was crying, but not quietly. It was raw, uncontrolled crying, the kind that sounds torn out of a person rather than chosen. He was pulling at his hair, pacing a step or two, then hitting the lockers again. The whole scene had a frantic, self-destructive energy that made the hallway seem suddenly too narrow. I froze. Not because I thought he was dangerous in that instant, not yet. Mostly because I had not expected to walk into something so private and so violent. At first it looked like a breakdown, a teenager losing control, a person under some terrible pressure. There are moments when you come upon another person's suffering and your mind stalls because it feels wrong to even be witnessing it. Then he looked up and saw me. What I saw in his eyes has stayed with me longer than the image of the lockers or the blood on his knuckles. I have seen angry eyes, scared eyes, sad eyes, embarrassed eyes. The look in his face that day did not fit any of those things. His eyes were empty in a way I had never seen before and have rarely seen since. Not blank, exactly. Blank would imply calm. This was something colder, like whatever should have been behind them had stepped away or burned out or sunk too deep to be reached. There was no embarrassment at being caught crying in a school hallway. No visible panic, no defensiveness, just that dead, flat look. We locked eyes for maybe a second or two. It felt much longer. There are moments that seem to stretch beyond time because your body is responding faster than language. I did not think through a decision in any clean way. I did not analyze him. I did not say, something is wrong with this person and I should leave. It was more immediate than that. Something in me recoiled. Some instinct below thought told me not to engage. not to ask if he was okay, not to offer comfort or curiosity or even acknowledgement. So I turned around and walked away. I tried to do it calmly, not too fast, not like I was afraid. I just moved in the other direction, got to my car, and left. At the time, I treated it as one disturbing moment and then pushed it aside. Teenagers have breakdowns. School hallways contain all kinds of private disasters. People cry, people rage, people snap under pressure. I did not connect that encounter to the murders. Not then. Then the truth came out. He was caught not because of some long, brilliant investigation, and not because the town solved its own nightmare through collective vigilance. He was caught because he told his girlfriend what he had done. I still don't know why. Guilt, maybe. Arrogance. A need to confess. A need to be known. Some people carry their secrets until they die. Others seem to need an audience for even their worst acts. Whatever the reason, she went to the police, and once she did, the whole story began to unravel. When people learned it was him, the town seemed to go quiet. That is the only way I can describe it, not literally silent, of course. People talked plenty, but the feeling changed. It was as if the air itself had thickened. The old confidence people had in their own judgment seemed to vanish all at once, because the problem was no longer only that a terrible thing had happened. The problem was that it had happened through someone we believed we understood. The same boy who had once been honored by firefighters and police. The same boy whose picture had been praised in the paper. The same boy adults had held up as an example. That is the kind of fact that does not just shock you. It humiliates your sense of certainty. It makes everyone question themselves. If he could be that person, and also this person, then what exactly had we all been looking at for years? The details that emerged afterward made everything worse. Before the murders, he had been moving through the neighborhood at night, checking for unlocked doors. That detail still disturbs me almost more than the murders themselves, because it reveals a kind of patience that is difficult to think about. He was not acting on one sudden impulse. He was testing, watching, moving quietly through the same streets people trusted, touching handles, trying gates, seeing which homes gave way easily and which didn't. It turned the whole neighborhood into a field of possibility in his mind. Not houses, not families, opportunities. When that information became public, my aunt immediately thought about her own house. She had security cameras installed all around the property. She lived on the same street as him, and at the time of the murders, she had been home alone with my two little cousins, who were only 2 and 5 years old. That fact alone is enough to make me feel sick even now. A house with 2 very small children inside, a woman alone, a street that still believed itself ordinary. She went back through her camera footage, and there he was, a hooded figure walking up to her front door in the dark. He jiggles the handle. It is locked. He doesn't leave. Instead, he moves around the side of the house and checks the gate. That is locked too. Then he stands there for a full minute, motionless. Just stands there, like he is thinking, deciding, measuring the effort against the possibility. After that, he walks away. My aunt was inside the entire time, alone with 2 sleeping children, completely unaware that someone was outside her home, deciding whether to try harder. When she told us that, my stomach dropped in a way that felt almost physical. It is one thing to hear about a horror that happened nearby. It is another thing to realize it came up to your own family's front door, touched the handle, tested the gate, and only then moved on. That kind of knowledge changes your relationship to chance. You stop thinking of safety as something solid. You start seeing it as a series of closed locks and near misses. I have thought a lot since then about what haunts me most. It is not only what he did, terrible as that is, it is who he was supposed to be. He wasn't an outsider. He wasn't the person people warned their children about. He was a local kid, a hero, someone the town had already folded into its best version of itself. He had once been praised by the same kinds of authorities that later had to hunt him down. That contradiction is what made the whole thing feel larger than one crime. It felt like a crack in the basic logic of how we sort people. I still think about that moment in the school hallway, about his fists hitting the lockers, about the crying, but mostly about his eyes. There was something in them that I recognized only later as absence. Not innocence lost, not sadness, not even madness in the dramatic sense. Just a vacancy so total it frightened me before I understood why. I wonder sometimes whether anyone else saw that look around the same time, whether teachers noticed something off, whether classmates brushed past him and felt the same instinctive recoil I felt, or whether I was simply unlucky enough to meet his gaze during a moment when whatever he had done was already hollowing him out from the inside. Maybe I imagine too much into that memory now because I know the ending. That is possible. My memory is not innocent. Once we learn what someone has done, the past rearranges itself around that knowledge. A strange glance becomes sinister. A silence becomes meaningful. A breakdown becomes evidence. I know that. I do not trust my memory blindly. But even allowing for that, I know how my body reacted in that hallway before I knew the truth. I know I felt something in that moment that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with instinct. It changed the way I see people after that. Not in a melodramatic way. I didn't become paranoid overnight. But I lost something uncomplicated. A certain trust in surfaces, a certain belief that good stories about people mean anything lasting. I learned that public praise does not reveal private character, that one brave act can sit beside unimaginable violence in the same person, that the categories we use to protect ourselves from confusion are much weaker than we pretend. It also changed the way I think about safety. We tell ourselves stories in order to feel secure. The dangerous person looks a certain way, comes from somewhere else, carries visible signs, belongs to a known category, but real danger does not always cooperate with those stories. Sometimes it grows in the middle of ordinary streets. Sometimes it lives near your family. Sometimes it tries your aunt's front door while she is inside with 2 little children and only turns away because the lock held. And sometimes it smiles in old newspaper photos while adults call it heroic. That, more than anything, is why the story still feels dreamlike to me all these years later. Not because it was loud, not because it was chaotic, but because it was quiet, ordinary, and close, too close. A familiar town, a familiar face, a familiar street, a school hallway lit with ugly fluorescent lights, a hooded figure pausing outside a locked house, a community learning too late that the monster was never outside the story at all. He had been inside it from the beginning, wearing a version of himself everyone preferred to believe. I have driven late at night my whole adult life and never thought much of it. There is a particular kind of comfort in empty roads, in the way the world reduces itself to headlights and white lines and the hum of an engine doing what it was made to do. No traffic, no impatience, no one cutting across lanes, just movement and quiet. I had driven the route home from my gym so many times that it had stopped requiring conscious attention. My hands knew the turns, my foot knew the curves. The road had become something my body handled while my mind drifted wherever it wanted to go. That familiarity is part of what made that night so difficult to process. Nothing about it announced itself as different until the moment it became the most different night of my life. It was close to 3 a.m. I had finished a late workout and I was carrying that specific post-gym exhaustion where your muscles feel wrung out and heavy, but your head is oddly quiet, emptied by the effort, not quite ready for sleep, but not wired either. The gym was about 40 minutes from my house, and I always took the back roads home. I had made a deliberate choice about that route early on and never revisited it. The back roads were quieter than the highway, fewer lights, fewer stops, and at that hour the time difference was minimal. My brain had evaluated the route once, found it acceptable, and filed it permanently under things that did not need to be reconsidered. One thing I had noted about those roads, the same way you note the existence of a spare tire in your trunk, was the cell service. Most of the route was a dead zone. I knew this. I had known it for a long time. It had never mattered before, and the human brain is efficient in the specific way of not spending energy on risks that have never materialized, so the dead zone was a known fact that produced no particular feeling. It was just a feature of the drive, like the particular left curve about 12 minutes in, or the stretch of road where deer sometimes stood in the headlights. The night started the way every other version of it had started. Radio low, windows slightly down, the darkness outside the kind of countryside dark that has no ambient light to soften it. I was thinking about food, about sleep, about nothing in particular. My body was doing the driving and my mind was somewhere else entirely, which is what happens on a road you have driven into a reflex. About halfway through, my headlights found something on the right shoulder, a white Honda CR-V, parked and facing toward the road. I registered it the way you register anything unusual on an otherwise empty road at 3 in the morning, not with alarm, but with a kind of low-level attention, the eyes adjusting their focus before the brain has decided whether the information matters. It was an odd place to park, not a driveway, not a designated pullout, just a stretch of roadside without obvious purpose. Still, there were explanations. Car trouble. Someone who had pulled over to sleep. Someone checking a map. The mind reaches for the ordinary first, because the ordinary is statistically more likely. Here is the thing that I am mildly ashamed of now, not because it was foolish in a dramatic way, but because of how mundane the reason was. I had been looking at CRVs at the time, not seriously shopping, but in that stage of low-grade research where you notice them on the road and picture yourself in one. I liked the idea of something reliable and roomy for hiking trips, something that could handle a dirt road to a trailhead without complaint. When I saw that white one sitting on the shoulder in my headlights, part of my brain went sideways into that completely irrelevant train of thought, the one that wondered if it was abandoned or for sale or just sitting there in a way I could get a closer look at. I passed it, then I made a U-turn and came back. This is the decision I return to most often when I think about that night, not because I think I was stupid exactly, but because of how small it felt. Not a decision, really, more like a mild impulse. The kind that produces no internal resistance, because nothing in the prior experience of your life has taught you to resist it. I had turned around to look at things on roadsides before. Everyone has. It had never meant anything. The U-turn felt like nothing, a minor interruption in the drive home, the kind of thing I would have forgotten entirely if the next 60 seconds had unfolded differently. I pulled up close enough for my headlights to illuminate the whole vehicle. I was looking at the body lines, the wheel arches, the way it sat on its suspension, the ordinary visual inventory of a person evaluating a car. My window was down. The road was silent. There was no movement anywhere. Then he stepped out from behind it. He had been on the far side, between the CRV and the tree line, in the space where my headlights couldn't reach. He came around the front of the vehicle and into the light. And my first instinct was the same one that made me turn around in the first place. Find the innocent explanation. Stranded driver. Someone who had stepped into the trees for a moment. A person who needed help and was relieved to see another car. His face killed that instinct immediately. The expression on it was not relief. It was not confusion. It was not the open, slightly embarrassed look of someone who has been caught in a private moment by an unexpected witness. What was on his face was anger, immediate and focused, the kind that is not a reaction to something that just happened, but something that has been sitting and waiting for a target. His jaw was set, his eyes locked onto me with the specific quality of attention that the body recognizes before the mind has translated it into language. Not looking at me, locating me. He started running, not moving toward me, not walking fast, not raising a hand. Running. Full sprint directly at my car, closing the distance with the committed urgency of someone who was not going to stop at the hood. His right hand was moving at his pocket as he ran, working at something, trying to pull something free that wasn't coming easily. My body moved before my thinking did. That is the honest account of it. I did not make a decision. My hands tightened on the wheel, my foot found the accelerator, and I was already in reverse before the cognitive part of me had finished assembling a sentence about what was happening. The tires gave a brief shriek against the road surface, and I went backward fast. Not smoothly, not with any particular control, just away. He was still running. His hand was still working at his pocket. The gap between us was closing faster than felt possible. There was a driveway a short distance back on my right. I reversed into it, the rear end swinging wide, then wrenched the wheel and shifted and went forward. The road ahead was empty and dark, and I went down it as fast as the car would go, which in a Honda Civic Si is fast enough to matter. For a moment, the rear view mirror showed me nothing but the road I had left behind, and I allowed myself the thought that it was over, that he would stand there and watch me go, and that would be the end of the story. It is a thought I now recognize as the mind trying to lower the stakes before it has enough information to justify doing so, a small mercy that the facts immediately revoked. Headlights appeared in the mirror. He was in the CR-V, and he was coming. The understanding of what that meant arrived whole and without softening. This was not a misunderstanding I had fled. This was not someone calling after me to explain themselves. He had gotten into his vehicle within seconds of my leaving, and he was on the same road I was on, moving in the same direction, and the road we were both on had no cell service and no houses visible, and nothing between the trees except more trees. There was no one to call. There was no one to see. There were just his headlights in my mirror and the engine under my hood and whatever distance I could maintain between the two. I pushed the car hard. The Civic Si has a tight, responsive engine, the kind built for a driver who wants the car to feel like an extension of decision rather than a machine with its own preferences, and it responded to everything I asked of it. I could feel the road through the wheel. I could feel the engine finding its range. The gap between my taillights and his headlights held, and then slowly, incrementally, began to grow. He did not flash his lights. He did not honk. He simply followed, which in some ways was more frightening than anything aggressive would have been. The silence of it, the patience of it, the sense that he was not frustrated or uncertain, but simply in pursuit, as if this was a thing he had done, with the same routine familiarity I brought to the drive itself. The chase lasted about 20 minutes. I know that because I checked the time when it started, and again when it ended, the part of my brain that files facts continuing to operate in the background, while the rest of me was entirely consumed by the road. 20 minutes is a long time when each second arrives with the awareness that a single mistake, a missed turn, a moment of hesitation, a tire that steps wrong on loose gravel could change everything. I did not allow myself to think past the next curve. I drove the way you drive when the road is the only thing in the world. Eventually, lights appeared ahead that were not headlights. Street lamps, then an intersection, then the accumulation of structures that marks the edge of a town. So the road widened and became something public and lit, and I knew where I was, and I knew where the police station was, and I went there directly. I watched his headlights in the mirror as I pulled toward the station. They slowed. They fell back. At an intersection a few blocks before I arrived, they turned and disappeared. Just like that, as simply as he had appeared, he was gone. The threat evaporating the moment institutional visibility arrived, which told me something about him that was its own kind of frightening. I pulled over and sat with my hands on the wheel for several minutes. My body was still operating on adrenaline that had nowhere to go, and my hands were shaking in the specific way of hands that have been gripping hard for a long time and have just been allowed to relax. I breathed. I waited. When I felt like I could speak in a way that would be understood, I went inside and reported everything I could remember. The car, the road, the direction he had come from, the direction he had gone. The face. That face. I described it to the officer, and then I sat with my own description for a moment, trying to understand why it had lodged so completely. It was not a remarkable face in the technical sense, nothing physically extraordinary, but the expression on it was one I had not seen before on a person who was not behind glass or in a photograph. The eyes had a quality I kept wanting to find a word for and kept failing. Not crazy in the performed sense, not wild in the obvious sense. Something more interior than that, more settled. Like whatever was operating behind them had long ago stopped consulting the part of us that moderates behavior in the presence of other people. Absence was the closest I could come to it, the absence of the thing that makes a person's face legible to another person. I went home. I slept badly. I went about the following days in the ordinary way that you go about days when something has happened that your regular life has no category for. A few days later, I was reading through local news, and I saw an article, "Escaped convict, considered highly dangerous, history of violence, likely intoxicated or under the influence of stimulants." A photograph included with the report. I knew him before I had finished loading the image. The same face I had described to the officer, the same face I had been replaying in the dark when I was trying to sleep, the same eyes with that particular quality of absence. He had been out there, on those roads, in that vehicle, that night. He had been waiting behind his car in the dark, and I had turned around and driven directly to him because I was mildly interested in the make and model, because nothing in my prior experience had taught me that a parked car on a back road at 3 a.m. might be a trap, because routine had made me comfortable in a place where I had no particular right to be comfortable. The struggle to get whatever was in his pocket free, the few seconds that struggle cost him. I think about those seconds more than I think about most things from that night. Whatever he was reaching for, it did not come out in time. That is the margin. That is what the entire story was balanced on in the end. A few seconds of mechanical resistance. I do not take that route anymore. I have not been on those roads since. I have also developed a different relationship with late-night drives generally, with the way routine builds comfort in conditions that have not earned it, with the particular vulnerability of a stretch of road where a phone call cannot reach anyone. These things accumulated into new habits that I do not examine too closely, because examining them too closely means thinking about why I have them, and thinking about why I have them takes me back to his face. There is something I have come to understand about that night that I did not understand while it was happening. I was not afraid of a stranger. I was afraid of a person who had, by the clear and specific quality of his attention, already decided what I was for. That is a different kind of fear than the ordinary fear of being in danger. It is the fear of being an object in someone else's story, of having been assigned a role without your knowledge, of arriving at a scene that was already in progress and finding that the script did not include a version where you left intact. I turned around on an empty road at 3 a.m. because I was curious about a car. He was waiting on the other side of it. The gap between those two facts, between the mundane impulse and what it almost cost me, is what I cannot stop measuring. Not because I want to punish myself for a reasonable decision that happened to be wrong, But because that gap is where the night actually lives, in the ordinary, the unremarkable moment before the face appeared, when I was just a tired person driving home and the worst thing I was thinking about was whether I should eat before I slept. That person still feels very close, and so does everything that came next. I live alone. That fact matters because when you live alone, you become the expert on your own house. You know the sounds it makes when the temperature drops and the walls contract. You know which floorboard announces itself under your left foot and which one stays quiet. You know the rhythm of your refrigerator cycling on and off in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. You know your dog's breathing when she's asleep versus when she's simply resting with her eyes closed. When you are the only person in a space, the space becomes legible to you in a way it never quite is when other people are moving through it. You know the baseline. You know what normal sounds like. That's why the singing was so hard to ignore. It started small. Everything that matters starts small. Late at night, when the house had settled into its usual quiet and I had been lying in bed long enough for the silence to feel complete, I would hear something. Not music, not a radio left on in another room. Something lower and less defined than that, like a voice carrying softly from somewhere it couldn't quite be placed. Humming or quiet singing, the kind a person does when they're alone and not thinking about it, unself-conscious and shapeless. I would lie still and listen and try to locate it, and it would not locate. It seemed to come from below me sometimes from inside the walls. It had no consistent direction, which was one of the things that made it so difficult to reason away. I started checking things. I checked my Xbox headset, which I sometimes left on, and which could theoretically pick up signals from other people's equipment. I went through my phone looking for apps running audio in the background. I turned the record player off, then unplugged it. I went through the house, turning things off one at a time, the methodical approach of a person who trusts logic and wants to give it every possible chance to win. Each time I did this, the sound would stop for a while, long enough for me to convince myself I had found the source, and then it would come back, not from whatever I had turned off, just back, from wherever it had always been coming from, patient and indifferent to my investigations. Along with the singing, there was a thumping, irregular, low, the kind of sound that a house full of old wood and settling foundations can produce on a cold night. But this wasn't cold nights specifically. This was a sound that came with the singing. Now that accompanied it the way footsteps accompany a person walking, a dull percussion, like weight shifting, like something knocking softly against timber from below. Not a pipe, not an animal in a wall. I know what those sound like. This had a different quality to it, one I couldn't identify, and therefore kept trying to explain away with whatever reasonable substitute was available. I told almost no one. I understood how it sounded. Hearing voices is not a thing you announce casually in conversation, not if you want the conversation to proceed normally afterward. So I kept it to myself and kept sleeping in the house and kept listening in the dark and kept telling myself there was an explanation I hadn't found yet. Weeks passed, then months. Some nights the house was completely quiet and I would feel foolish for having been unsettled at all. Other nights I lay on my back with my eyes open for hours, listening to something that had no business being there, which I could not stop hearing and could not explain and could not quite bring myself to fully believe. My dog's name doesn't matter as much as what she did one night, maybe 4 or 5 months into all of this. I was in my bedroom. It was late, the kind of late where you've stopped expecting the night to offer anything new and you're just waiting for sleep to arrive. She came through the door at a run, which was unusual by itself because she was not an anxious dog. She was steady and calm and comfortable in the house in the way dogs are when they've lived somewhere long enough to own it. But she came in that night like Something had sent her, and what I saw when I looked at her was not curiosity and not alertness. It was fury. Her hackles were up the full length of her back. She was snarling at the floor, not at me, not at the door, but at the floor itself. And she started digging at the carpet with her front claws, tearing at it, trying to get through or under it, trying to reach whatever was below. I had never seen her do anything like that, not once in all the time I had known her. The fear that had been sitting at a low, manageable level for months suddenly came up hard and fast and settled in my chest, like something physical. Animals are not dramatic. They do not perform alarm for an audience. If she was behaving that way, there was something there to behave that way about. I got her out of the room, shut the door. Perrin got my rifle. My hands were not entirely steady, but my thinking was clearer than I expected. The particular clarity that comes when the body understands that something real is happening and stops wasting resources on doubt. I sat in the house with the rifle and waited for morning. She stayed pressed against my leg the entire time, which was its own kind of information. She wasn't curious anymore. She was afraid, and she had decided that being close to me was the best available option. I dozed at some point because exhaustion doesn't negotiate, and I woke up with my hand still on the gun and my neck stiff, and the early light coming through the windows, and the house was quiet, and everything looked the way it always looked, and somehow that made it worse rather than better. As soon as the light was full enough to see clearly, I went outside. I walked the perimeter of the house the way you do when you're looking for something you don't want to find. Slowly, checking the ground, checking the foundation, checking the places where the house met the earth. I had done this before, after bad nights, and found nothing. This time I went further, pushed through the overgrowth along the side of the house, where the bushes had been allowed to grow thick and close against the siding. And behind one of them, mostly swallowed by branches that had grown undisturbed for what looked like years, was a door. Low to the ground, weathered wood, old hinges, a crawl-space door. I stood there and looked at it for a long moment. I was trying to remember if I had ever known it was there, if it had come up when I moved in, not if someone had mentioned it, or if I had seen it during a walkthrough and simply filed it away as unimportant. I could not remember it. I could not place it in any version of the house I carried in my head. The bush in front of it had grown the way bushes grow when nothing disturbs them for a long time, filling in gradually, sealing it off, making it part of the background. I went back inside and got tools and came back out and started cutting the bush away. I didn't care what time it was or how it looked. I cut until the door was fully exposed, which took most of the morning, and then I stood in front of it and looked at what I had uncovered. It was unlocked, not broken, not forced, just unlocked, closed, but with nothing securing it. The kind of door that anyone could open from either side with a simple pull. I opened it. The crawl space was not empty. This is the sentence that I have never been able to follow with anything that makes it better, because there is nothing that makes it better. The crawl space beneath my house, the dark, low space under my floors where the pipes ran and the earth stayed cold and damp, was not empty. Against the dirt floor, directly inside the door, there was a pallet. On top of the pallet were blankets arranged in the specific way that someone arranges blankets when they sleep in a place regularly, not thrown there, but organized, settled into a shape that fit a body. Beside the pallet was a teddy bear. I looked at it for longer than I looked at most of the other things, because it was the detail that didn't fit any category I had available. Not threatening exactly, not innocent either, just wrong, in a way that the other things, as terrible as they were wrong in a more straightforward direction. There was a garbage bag filled with clothes. I recognized pieces of it, not vaguely, not as the kind of thing that looks like something you own. I recognized specific items. A pair of shoes I had gotten rid of months earlier, a shirt I had worn until it was past worn and thrown away, my things retrieved from wherever I had disposed of them, brought here, kept here. There were Legos scattered on the dirt near the pallet. Children's Legos, loose pieces, no set or project visible, just pieces. I did not spend long thinking about what the Legos meant. Some things you look at and move past quickly because stopping would cost too much. Then I looked to my right. The camera was positioned on a small elevated surface, now angled deliberately upward, aimed through a gap that I now understood corresponded to a specific area of my floor. It was not old, it was not broken, it was a working camera, placed with care, pointed at the ceiling of the crawl space, which was the floor of my house, in a spot that had been chosen because of what could be heard through it, or perhaps seen through gaps in it, or both. It was pointed at my life. I took the camera inside and connected it to an old laptop I kept, but rarely used. Part of me wanted to destroy it without looking at anything. That part of me understood correctly that what was on it was going to change something. But I needed to see. I needed the full shape of what had been happening, because without it, I would spend the rest of my life wondering, and wondering felt worse than knowing. There were several recordings. Each one began the same way. A man moving through the woods at the edge of my property, moving carefully, low and deliberate. The walk of someone who had made this trip many times and knew exactly where to put his feet to avoid making noise. He would reach the crawlspace door, pull it open, and slip inside. And then, from inside that dark space beneath my floors, he would begin to sing. It was the singing I had been hearing for months. The same voice, the same shapeless quality, the same late-night frequency that I had lain awake listening to and blamed on electronics and old wood and my own tired imagination. The recordings continued after he was inside. You could hear my house above him, footsteps, running water, the sounds of a person moving through their own home in the ordinary way, without any awareness of being observed, and he would narrate it, quietly, conversationally, with a kind of casual intimacy that was worse than anything aggressive would have been. He used my username, the one from an online profile, as if he knew me, as if we had some relationship, as if my private life was content he was entitled to consume and comment on. He said it warmly, which was the worst part. There was no malice in his tone. There was something that sounded like affection, or what affection becomes when it is entirely disconnected from the reality of another person. One recording was from a night I had not been alone, a night I had brought someone home. I will not describe what he said during that recording in detail, because some of it I have worked to put at a distance, and I intend to keep it there. What I will say is that he spoke about hoping to hear us together, said it the way a person says something they feel entitled to, and his voice had that same warm, unhurried quality throughout. He was not ashamed. He did not sound like a man who believed he was doing something wrong. I turned the laptop off. I sat with what I had just watched for a few minutes, which was all I could manage, and then I moved. I destroyed the camera. I wiped the files. I threw everything out. The camera pieces, the blankets, the garbage bag of clothes, the teddy bear, all of it. I did not call the police. I understand looking back that this was a mistake, but in the moment I was operating on something more basic than strategy. I wanted it gone. I wanted every piece of it out of my house and out of my hands, and I wanted it done immediately. I went to the hardware store and I bought the heaviest locks they had, and I came home and installed them on the crawlspace door myself, working quickly, hands still not quite steady, until the door was secured in a way that could not be defeated from outside with a simple pull. I believed that was the end of it. That night, late, the singing started, faint at first, then fuller, settling into the same register I had been hearing for months, coming up through the floor from somewhere below me. I was already sitting up in bed before it had fully registered, and then I heard something else. a metallic sound, scraping, the specific complaint of a lock being worked against, then the duller sound of something being pulled and resisting. He was at the door. He had come back the same night, in the same hours, following the same route through the same woods to the same door, and he had found it locked, and he was trying to understand why. His voice, when it came, was not the warm, narrating voice from the recordings. It was sharp and personal and directed outward. "Son of a bitch," my dog erupted. She threw herself at the interior door, barking with the full commitment of an animal that has located the source of months of wrongness and is done being patient about it. I went to the window and moved the blinds carefully, just far enough to see. He was real. He was there, standing at the side of my house in the dark, a man in the ordinary visual sense of the word, not large and not small, working at the lock with something in his hand. I had known on some level, from the moment I opened the crawlspace door that morning, that he was a real person and not something I had constructed in an anxious mind. But seeing him was different. Seeing him made all the months of lying awake and doubting myself and checking my electronics and wondering if something was wrong with me collapse into this single concrete image of a man standing outside my house because he believed he had the right to be there. I went outside with the gun. I did not shout. I did not announce myself. I stepped onto the porch and turned on the light and stood there. He screamed. Not a confrontational sound, not something defiant. A pure, reflexive scream of a person who has been surprised in a way their body interprets as mortal threat. And then he ran. He ran into the woods, and I stood on the porch and listened to the sound of him going. The branches and undergrowth and the clumsy, panicked noise of flight until it faded into nothing and the night was quiet again. I stood there for a long time after the sound was gone. I changed the locks again over the following days. I changed other things too, interior locks, exterior lights. The way I moved through my own house, I became aware of my routines in a new way. The way you become aware of something after learning it has been observed. I thought about all the ordinary evenings I had moved through my home without thinking about them, the showers and the meals and the nights I was not alone. And I thought about him below me, narrating, singing quietly to himself in the dark beneath my floors. And I understood that some part of me was going to be aware of that for a very long time. He never came back. Or if he did, he came back differently, quietly enough that I never knew, which is a thought I do not keep company with voluntarily. The sounds stopped. The house returned to the quiet I had known before it all started, and I learned, slowly and imperfectly, to trust that quiet again. What stays with me is not the single moment of seeing him outside, though that image is still sharp and available whenever I let it come forward. What stays with me is the duration, the months of it, the patience required to do what he did, to come back night after night, to lie in the dirt beneath someone's floors and listen to their life above you and find it sufficient. The intimacy of it, which is the word that fits, even though it makes me uncomfortable to use it. He knew the sounds of my house better than most people who had ever been inside it. He knew my routines. He had retrieved my discarded things and kept them. He had given me a name, his version of one, and used it warmly and privately in the dark. Whatever he had been building toward in all those months of watching and listening and coming back again, I don't know. I have thought about the trajectory of it, the way a thing with that much investment and patience tends to move towards something, and then I stop thinking about it because the destination is not a place I need to visit. I got lucky in specific ways. A light sleeping dog, a night I happened to check the perimeter, a bush that had grown thick enough to hide a door for years, finally being cut away at the right moment. These are thin things to have standing between you and whatever comes next. At night sometimes, when the house is quiet in the way it's supposed to be quiet, I still find myself listening, not because I expect to hear anything, just because I learned over those months that the baseline can change without your permission, that what sounds like silence can have something living inside it, patient and close just below the floor. I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, not the way you think about something that traumatized you, but in the quiet moments, the ones where your brain isn't busy with anything and a stray memory floats up without being invited. It surfaces and I turn it over for a while, looking for the edge I missed, the detail that would finally make it settle into something explainable. Then I put it back down and go on with my day because there's nothing else to do with it. What makes it difficult to talk about is how undramatic it was. There were no sounds that didn't belong, no one lurking in a doorway, nothing that would have made a stranger watching from outside say, yes, that's clearly the moment things went wrong. It felt like an ordinary afternoon, and the strangeness crept in only at the edges, only when I stopped and compared notes with the rest of the world. That's the part that doesn't leave me. Not fear, exactly, something quieter and more persistent than fear. A low-level unease with the reliability of things I had always taken for granted. I was in college. It was late summer, the kind of afternoon that feels almost aggressive in its pleasantness. Warm air and clear sky and the particular quality of light that makes the inside of any building feel like a mild punishment. I had a physics class that ran late in the day, the last one on my schedule, and anyone who has sat through a technical lecture in that slot knows the specific exhaustion of it. Your body is already leaning toward the door before the professor has finished the first sentence. You watch the clock the way a dog watches a door handle, waiting for something to change. I remember checking my wristwatch that afternoon and then looking at the clock mounted on the classroom wall. They agreed. I remember this clearly, not as something I made a point of noting at the time, but because later I would need to go back and inventory every moment where I knew with certainty what time it was. That was one of them. The two clocks matched. I was sitting in a lecture that had not yet ended, knowing exactly when it would, watching the minute hand on the wall behave exactly the way minute hands are supposed to behave. Eventually, the class let out, and I walked to my car through air that felt too good to be wasted on a parking lot. The drive home from campus was about 20 miles, and it wasn't a straight shot. It went through a mix of main roads and then quieter country roads, the kind that narrow down and lose their painted lines and pass through stretches where you can go a mile without seeing another car. I had driven it enough times that it was automatic. Every curve and incline filed away in some part of my brain that handled repetitive tasks without requiring my full attention. I liked the drive, mostly because of the CB radio. This was more than a hobby for me. I understood the equipment the way some people understand their cars or their instruments, the technical specifics of it, the way signal strength rose and fell with elevation, the dead zones and the sweet spots along a route. I had the whole 20 miles mapped in my head. I knew which high points gave reliable reach, which stretches were useless, and in which order they came. My routine was to call home from the road. My mother especially had come to count on it. She timed things around my calls, and when I pulled into the driveway, supper was usually waiting. It was a small domestic system, comfortable and reliable, the kind of thing you don't appreciate until it stops working. That's what I was thinking about as I left the campus parking lot. Not anything unusual, just the drive, the radio, the meal waiting at the end of it. The fog appeared on a stretch of road that dipped slightly before rising again, maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the drive. My first thought was that I was seeing things wrong. Late summer afternoons don't produce fog. There's no temperature differential to create it, no cold air settling into low points at that hour. Fog belongs to early morning, to autumn, to days when the whole sky is gray. Not to a warm, sunny afternoon with a clear horizon, but it was there, a low, thin layer of it sitting across the road, like something that had forgotten to leave when the morning did. And it had a cast to it, a faint greenish quality that I noticed and couldn't quite file away. Not vivid, not the kind of color that would have made someone stop the car, just enough to be wrong. I slowed a little as I drove through it, the way you slow through any patch of limited visibility, more out of instinct than concern. It didn't cover much road, just a short section, and then it was behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I kept driving and thought about something else, and the fog receded into the category of odd things that have explanations I hadn't thought of yet. At the first high point, I called home. No answer. I told myself that was fine. CB radio was inconsistent. Signals didn't always carry. People didn't always have the radio on. I kept driving. At the second high point, the one that almost always connected, I called again. Still nothing. A small knot of unease formed somewhere in my chest, low and quiet, not yet insistent. I told myself they were busy. I told myself there was interference. I told myself the many reasonable things that get told to anxiety before it has enough evidence to argue back. At the third point, I tried again. Silence. That was unusual enough to feel wrong. Not alarming, not the kind of wrong that makes you pull over, but wrong in the specific way of a pattern breaking. We had a routine. My mother especially kept to it. If I called, someone answered. That was just how it worked. The 3 high points with no response meant the routine had broken, and I didn't know why, and not knowing why was enough to make the rest of the drive feel different. I came over the hill that looked down across the town, the spot with the best line of sight and the strongest reception I had on the whole route. I picked up the mic and called, and kept calling as I rolled down the hill, into the streets, through the familiar turns toward home. The radio gave back nothing but its own quiet static, the sound of a frequency that had nothing to say. When I pulled into the driveway and looked at the house, the front door was standing open. Not ajar, not cracked from a latch that hadn't caught. Wide open, the kind of open that means someone either left in a hurry or was moving things. Because you don't leave a door standing that wide on purpose without a reason. Through the opening, I could see straight through the length of the house to the back door, which was also open, framing a rectangle of backyard light. The house was a tunnel of open doors, and looking through it, I couldn't see anyone moving. I was out of the car before I had fully processed what I was doing. I went in through the front and moved through the rooms quickly, calling out. The house echoed my voice back at me. Kitchen empty, living room empty. The silence that sits in a house when no one is home and the appliances aren't running and the air isn't moving. It had the specific quality of absence, not just quiet but vacant, and the open doors made it feel exposed in a way that ordinary emptiness doesn't. I went out the back and found my mother hanging laundry. She was moving through it the way she moved through all domestic tasks, without rush, with the practiced economy of someone who had done a thing so many times that it required no conscious effort. She looked up when she heard me, and her expression was one of mild surprise. The look a person makes when something has happened slightly out of order. She said I was home early. I told her I wasn't. I held up my wrist and showed her the watch and told her what time it said. She looked at it and told me that couldn't be right. She said it was too early. Supper wasn't started yet. She said it with the calm certainty of someone stating a fact they have no reason to doubt. We went inside together. I walked to the kitchen clock first, the one that had lived on that wall my entire life. The one I had looked at 10,000 times. It was behind my watch by nearly 2 hours. I checked the clock in the living room. The same. I went through the house, and every clock I found was telling a time that was almost 2 hours earlier than what my watch said. They all agreed with each other. They disagreed, collectively and consistently, with me. My mother suggested a power outage. It was a sensible thought. Outages reset digital clocks, and if the power had gone out and come back while I was at school, all the clocks would have lost time and been reset or simply stopped and restarted from the wrong point. That could explain the discrepancy. It was a reasonable explanation, and I was willing to accept it. Then we turned on the radio to check the broadcast time. The radio matched the house clocks. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a while without saying much. My mother said something, asked something, and I answered, but I was doing something else underneath the conversation. I was going back through the afternoon, methodically, the way you go back through a math problem looking for where the logic broke. I remembered the classroom clock matching my watch before I left. I remembered the drive, which had felt normal in its duration, which had taken what I judged to be a normal amount of time. I had not pulled over. I had not stopped for gas or taken a detour. I had driven the route I always drove, at the speed I always drove it, and the route took a fixed amount of time. And yet I had arrived nearly 2 hours earlier than the rest of the world expected me to. My watch had not malfunctioned. I had not misread it at school. I had not left early. I was certain of that. I remembered the end of the lecture, remembered packing my bag, remembered the parking lot, and I could not have, covered 20 miles of country road in the time a 20-mile drive would normally take, and then somehow arrived 2 hours ahead of schedule. I sat at the kitchen table and my head felt heavy in the way it does at the end of a long day, when your body has quietly used up everything it had. And I thought about the fog. I thought about the way it had sat on that particular stretch of road, in the wrong season, at the wrong time of day, with that faint wrong color to it. I thought about how I had driven through it without stopping because there was no reason to stop, because it hadn't seemed significant, because ordinary life proceeds through minor oddities without pausing to investigate each one. And then I thought something that I wish I hadn't thought, because it was the kind of thought that gets comfortable in your head and refuses to leave. I thought about what would have happened if I had arrived home at my regular time, the time my watch was claiming, the time I believed I was traveling through. Would the driveway have been empty? Would the house have been silent? Would there have been some version of this afternoon, already in progress, that I would have arrived to find mid-scene, like walking into a room where something is happening that wasn't meant for you? I stopped thinking about it, deliberately, consciously, the way you choose not to look down when you are high up somewhere. Some thoughts don't lead anywhere useful. I never found an explanation that fully satisfied me. The power outage theory was the most reasonable, but it didn't account for the broadcast radio time, which is not affected by local outages, and it didn't account for my watch, which had been correct at school and had not been touched between school and home. Faulty memory was possible, but felt dishonest. I remembered that afternoon with the clarity of something that mattered, and the things I was most certain of were precisely the ones that needed to be wrong for the simple explanation to work. What I am left with, years out, is not a story with a clean ending. Nothing bad happened. I ate supper eventually, probably late, probably after my mother had started it in a hurry because I had arrived before she was ready. Life continued in the ordinary way. I drove that road again many times afterward, through the same dip and rise where the fog had been, and it was never there again, just road. But I think about it. I think about the space between when I left that classroom, watch synchronized with the wall clock, and when I arrived home in a house that believed I was 2 hours early. I think about what was in that space, what the afternoon was doing while I was apparently moving through it, faster than time was willing to account for. I think about that drive through the fog and the small wrongness of the color and the season and how I noted it and then continued on. Because continuing on is what you do. There are gaps in ordinary life that you don't notice because you're not looking for them. moments where the seams show briefly, before everything smooth over and returns to what it's supposed to be. Most of those gaps mean nothing. Most of them are just misread clocks and tired eyes and the brain imposing patterns on coincidence. But sometimes the gap is 2 hours wide, and you drove through it without knowing. And the fog you passed through on an afternoon with no reason for fog was the color of something that doesn't belong. And you kept driving, and later you cannot tell anyone with certainty what happened in between. That's what stays with me. Not the fear of what it might mean. Just the knowledge that on one ordinary afternoon, driving a road I knew well, something happened to the time, and I was the only one who was there for it, and I still don't know what it was. I was 18 years old, and it was my first week of college, which meant that everything around me was already slightly disorienting in the low-grade way that new beginnings tend to be. New schedule, new buildings, new faces that hadn't yet become familiar. The constant mild vertigo of a life that has just rearranged itself into a shape you haven't learned to move through comfortably yet. I didn't have a car. That had never been a problem before, but now it meant that my mornings were shaped by bus timetables rather than my own convenience, and my early class meant waking before the sun had made any visible commitment to rising. I had done the walk twice before that morning, once to figure out the route and once on the first day of class. Both times had been unremarkable. The kind of experience that gets filed away immediately as routine. The street, the distance, the bus stop at the end of it. My brain had already begun converting it into background, into something that happened automatically while my attention was elsewhere. That is what routine does. It takes the unfamiliar and makes it invisible, and there is comfort in that process. But comfort has a cost that you only discover in retrospect. The morning it happened was cold in that particular early autumn way. Not the deep cold of winter, but the kind that gets into the gap between your collar and your neck and reminds you that the warmth of the previous season is finished. I pulled my sweater tighter as I stepped outside and looked at the street, which was quiet in the way streets are quiet before the day has properly assembled itself. Dark windows, parked cars, the distant sound of traffic on a road I couldn't see. The sky was that specific shade between black and blue that belongs only to the hour before sunrise, when the darkness has started to thin, but the light hasn't yet committed. I had a habit, learned gradually and without ever making a conscious decision about it, of paying attention when I was alone outside. Not paranoia, nothing that disrupted my thoughts or made the world feel threatening in a general way. Just an awareness, a quiet, ongoing scan of what was around me that I had developed the way women tend to develop it, through accumulated small experiences that teach you that the world does not always extend the same courtesy in every direction. It was not something I thought about, it was just something I did. I saw him when he was about 50 feet away. The distance itself was the first thing that registered as unusual. At 50 feet, in ordinary circumstances, a stranger on a sidewalk is just a shape. You note them and continue. There is no reason at that distance to form any particular impression, but something about this one made me focus before I had decided to focus. The way your eyes move toward a sound before your brain has identified what made it. He was walking toward me on the same side of the street, and he was walking in a way that I felt in my body before I could describe it in words. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate in some quality that I registered as wrong. I remember my mind starting its inventory of explanations. People walk early in the morning. People have jobs that start before dawn, animals that need walking, reasons to be outside that have nothing to do with the person approaching them. I was being dramatic. I was scaring myself on a perfectly ordinary street because I was tired and new to a routine and prone to finding threat in things that weren't threatening. These are the thoughts that a reasonable person has. They are also the thoughts that can get you killed if you follow them too far in the wrong direction at the wrong time. His collar was pulled up high, folded over itself against the lower half of his face. His hat was pulled down low. Between the two there was almost nothing visible, just a narrow band of features that told me nothing. I noticed this, and the noticing tightened something in my chest. And then I noticed myself noticing and felt embarrassed about it. That familiar, self-correcting embarrassment of a young woman who has been taught explicitly and implicitly that her discomfort is probably an overreaction and that acting on it is an inconvenience to others. I almost crossed the street. I thought about it seriously, ran the calculation, and then put it away because of how it would look, which is a sentence I find difficult to read back now. I was more concerned with appearing rational than with acting on something my body was trying very clearly to communicate. I stayed on my side of the street and kept walking. What I had done, without fully realizing I had done it, was slide my hand into my sleeve and close it around the pepper spray in my pocket. I had carried it for months, since my mother pressed it into my hand the first time I started commuting alone. And I rarely thought about it, but my hand had found it on its own, moving before the conscious part of me had agreed to be concerned, acting on information that was still working its way up through the layers of deliberate thought toward acknowledgement. Some part of me had already decided. When he was close enough to pass, I shifted slightly to the right to give him room. The small, automatic adjustment that people make on sidewalks 100 times a day, the polite choreography of strangers sharing a path. It was so ordinary that I did it without thinking. His hand came over my mouth with a force that snapped my head back. It happened with a speed and sureness that left no space for disbelief. There was no preamble, no moment of ambiguity. His palm pressed hard against my lips and my teeth, the heel of his hand covering my nose. And his other arm came around my body and pulled, angling me off the sidewalk in a direction I was not choosing to go. The grip was not exploratory or uncertain. It was practiced in the specific way of something that had been thought about in advance. My mind did what minds do in the first instant of something incomprehensible. It went blank. Not silent, not calm, but blank in the way a screen goes blank when the signal is interrupted before it finds its way back to a picture. I wanted to scream, and the scream was there, and my throat knew it was there, and my mouth could not reach it. The hand was too heavy. The shock was too complete, and my body was taking a moment it did not entirely have to understand that this was real, and that the response it had always imagined it would produce in this situation was not, in fact, immediately available. What was available was my right hand, already inside my sleeve, already around the pepper spray. I don't remember making a decision. I remember the spray going off, the sound of it, the hiss, and then the immediate change in the quality of his grip, not releasing but faltering, the muscles doing something involuntary that cost him a fraction of his certainty. He held on. I sprayed again, aiming upward toward where his face had to be given where his hands were on me, and this time there was a sound from him, an exhaled curse or something wordless, and the grip broke. I sprayed a third time into the space where he had been, and then I ran, not in the careful, considered way of someone executing a plan. I ran the way a body runs when it has made a single decision so completely that everything else has been suspended, legs taking over, arms pumping, lungs burning before I had gone a full block. I still had the pepper spray in my hand, knuckles white around it, and I did not loosen my grip for the entire 4 blocks home. I ran past people who were beginning to appear on the street as the morning assembled itself, and I do not remember any of their faces. I was crying in the way you cry when your body is producing the tears faster than you can manage them, not from grief, but from the flooding excess of something that has nowhere else to go. Yeah, I reached my front door and got inside and locked it, and then I sat down on the floor with my back against it because my legs had nothing left. and the door was solid and real and between me and the street, and I stayed there for a long time. My hands were shaking in a sustained, rhythmic way that I could not stop. My chest was heaving in patterns that did not quite match breathing. The pepper spray was still in my fist. I understood I was safe, and my body did not yet agree, and there was nothing to do but wait for the two of them to reach the same conclusion. The physical aftermath faded across the following hours. The shaking resolved. The adrenaline metabolized. I ate something, I think, and I called someone. And at some point, the morning became an afternoon, and the day moved forward. The way days insist on moving forward regardless of what has happened inside them. The external evidence disappeared quickly. The internal evidence did not. I noticed it in the small things first. The way my hand found my keys before I stepped outside. Not casually, as it had before, but tightly, fingers laced between them, which was a grip I had read about but never consciously adopted. The way I noted every person on the sidewalk ahead of me and did not allow myself to feel embarrassed about it anymore. The way I no longer spent any energy on the question of whether my instincts were being dramatic, because I had been given a clear and expensive answer to that question and I intended to keep it. Several weeks later, I read about a girl who had gone missing from a nearby area. She had been walking to a pharmacy early in the morning, alone on a street not unlike mine. The reports were initially cautious, offering the range of explanations that reports offer when the facts are still assembling. A month after she disappeared, her body was found on the side of a freeway. I read the article twice. I sat with the specific stillness that descends when something that has been abstract becomes concrete, when a news story about a stranger stops being something that happened to someone else and becomes something with a physical address in your own life. I thought about her walk to the pharmacy, about the morning she had, about whether she had felt something on the street that she talked herself out of acting on. I thought about my own morning, about the 50 feet of sidewalk I had almost crossed to the other side of and then decided against, about the pepper spray my mother gave me that I almost left at home that day because it was bulky in my pocket and I was in a hurry. I do not know if it was the same person. I have never known. The geography was close enough and the timing was close enough that the question wrote itself and has never fully been answered. Not for me, not with the certainty that would allow it to stop asking. I have lived with the not knowing for more than 10 years now, and I have learned that it does not go away, that it becomes, instead, something you carry, something that adjusts its weight from time to time, but never fully puts itself down. What I know is this. I was 18 years old, and it was my first week of college, and I almost did not carry the pepper spray that morning, and I almost crossed the street and then felt ashamed of myself and went back, and I almost filed the discomfort away as an overreaction and walked past him with my hands loose at my sides. Almost, almost, almost. The word that lives at the center of the memory, the hinge on which the whole story turns. The thing that separates the version of events I can tell from the version that has no one left to tell it. I think about the girl walking to the pharmacy. I think about whether she had the same feeling and whether anyone had ever taught her that the feeling was worth trusting, or whether she had been taught the way so many of us are taught, that the polite and reasonable and socially acceptable response to discomfort on a public street is to manage it quietly and keep walking. I think about how thin the line is between instinct and embarrassment, and how much of our safety can depend on which one we listen to in the moment before a hand reaches out. I was 18. I was lucky. I carried something in my pocket that I almost left at home, and I am still here to know the difference between almost and not. That is not a small thing, but it should not have had to cost what it did to learn it. I was 15 when it happened, and even now I can remember it with a clarity that doesn't feel normal. Most memories soften over time. They lose edges, they blur into a general feeling, and after enough years you start to wonder if you're remembering the actual event or just the story you've told yourself about it since. But this one never changed that way. It stayed sharp, not every second of it maybe, but the parts that mattered. The feeling in my stomach when the van didn't turn. The sound of his voice when he called me beautiful. The stillness of that empty parking lot. Some memories seem to settle somewhere deeper than the mind. They stay in the body. This is one of those. What makes it stranger is that it didn't feel dramatic while it was happening. There was no warning music, no obvious moment where the world announced that danger had entered the room. It was just a normal day, the kind of day I had already lived many times, and then one small thing shifted and then another, and by the time I understood what was happening, I was already trapped inside it. At 15, my world was still small in the way teenage worlds often are. School took up most of my week. Friends took up the rest. And at that point in my life, dance practice had become one of the main things shaping my days. One of my close friends was preparing for her quinceañera, and a group of us had been practicing at her house almost every day. The routines were repetitive and exhausting, but in the way fun things can be exhausting when you're young. We complained about our feet hurting, laughed at mistakes, repeated the same counts again and again, and measured time by how close we were getting to the event itself. Her family lived in a neighborhood where most people spoke Spanish, and most of the girls I danced with were Hispanic. I was the only white girl in the group, but it never felt like an issue. It was just a fact, nothing more. I didn't speak much Spanish, only a few words and phrases, but we had our own rhythm together anyway. I could follow enough to get by, and my friends usually filled in the rest. I felt comfortable there, safe even. The neighborhood was familiar by then. Her house was familiar. The routines of going there and leaving were familiar. And familiarity is one of the reasons danger gets past us so easily. Once something becomes part of ordinary life, you stop testing it. None of us could drive yet, so going home usually meant taking a taxi. This was a small town, and things worked a little differently there than they might have in a larger city. Taxis were not always clearly marked. A lot of people ran small transportation businesses, especially within the local Hispanic community. You didn't always see a bright logo on the side of the car or a number on the door. Sometimes it was just a person with a vehicle doing rides the way everyone knew they did. Nobody around us acted like this was strange. It was normal in the way many local systems are normal when you grow up around them. We had done it before, many times. Nothing bad had happened. That day, it was just me and two other girls who needed a ride home. I remember that clearly because if there had been a larger group, maybe things would have unfolded differently. Or maybe not. That's the problem with memory after fear. It keeps generating alternate versions of the same day, as if one changed detail could explain why things almost went another way. We got into an older minivan that looked like it had been on the road a long time. It was dented in places, worn down in the way work vehicles often are, and it had a smell that bothered me faintly even then. Old upholstery, dust, something stale underneath it. Not strong enough to alarm me, just unpleasant enough that I noticed it and then dismissed it. That is another thing I think about now. How many small warning signs are first dismissed simply because they are easy to explain. A shabby van is just a shabby van. A strange smell is just an old car. A man asking questions is just a driver doing his job. At the time, that is what it all seemed like. Since I didn't speak much Spanish, my friends usually did most of the talking with drivers. They told him that he should take me home first. The reason was simple. I could explain where I lived more easily in English, while they could give better directions in Spanish after I got out. It made sense. There was nothing unusual about that. The driver agreed. Then he asked where they lived, and they told him. That part didn't seem strange either. Looking back now, I can see that was the first moment the pattern shifted. Not because asking their addresses was itself suspicious, but because it gave him information and control at the same time. At 15, I didn't think in those terms. I thought in the terms children are taught to think in. Adults doing routine things, drivers asking for directions, one stop before another. Ordinary explanations for ordinary moments. Instead of taking the road toward my neighborhood, he drove to theirs first. I remember feeling confused but not yet frightened. Confusion came before fear. Maybe he wanted to get their directions out of the way first, I thought. Maybe there was some easier route I didn't know about. Maybe I had misunderstood. The mind reaches for harmless reasons. First, because harmless reasons are easier to live with. The van pulled up in front of their house, and the girls got out like nothing was wrong. I waved goodbye. They waved back. The doors shut, and just like that, it was over for them and beginning for me. The moment the van started moving again, with only me left inside, something changed in my body. The silence felt different immediately. With the other girls there had been chatter, a movement, another layer between me and him. Once they were gone, the van seemed to become smaller. The sound of the engine got louder. The tires against the road felt harsher somehow. I became aware of things I had not really registered before. His age, his size, the way the dashboard was cracked in places, the sag of the seats, the closeness of the cab to the back. It was as if the removal of those two girls also removed whatever illusion of safety had been covering the situation. I did not panic. That is important to me now because people often imagine danger arriving with instant, full clarity, but that isn't how it felt. It felt more like my body knew first. A tightening, a watchfulness, the sense that something had tilted slightly out of place. I had grown up hearing the same warnings most girls hear. Be careful, stay alert. So don't trust too easily. Don't be alone if you can help it. Those warnings become part of you before you fully understand them. They settle into instinct. He started talking to me. His tone was casual, almost friendly. He told me he was doing this work to save money for a vacation for his family. I remember how specific that detail felt. Family, vacation. It was such a normal thing to say that it did exactly what it was probably meant to do. It made him seem harmless. A man with a family. A man working hard. A man with plans. I could feel my guard lower just a little. That is one of the things that still bothers me about the memory. How eager I was to accept reassurance. How quickly I wanted him to be safe. But I was 15. 15-year-olds are still learning how much danger can wear ordinary language. We got closer to my area, and I began to relax again. That is what makes the next moment feel so violent in memory. Not because he touched me then, not because he threatened me then, but because I had just started to let my body unclench. I recognized the streets. I felt the familiar sense of being almost home. Home has gravity when you are young. Once you begin to feel its pull, you assume the danger has passed. Then we reached my street. I told him to turn right. I even pointed just to be clear. He didn't turn. He didn't slow down. He kept driving straight. The effect that had on me was immediate and physical. It felt like the floor of the van dropped away. My stomach fell. My heart started pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. My hands moved before my thoughts fully formed. I reached for the door handle automatically, as if some ancient part of me had already decided this was wrong, while the rest of my mind was still catching up. He looked at me and said I was very beautiful. Even now, writing that makes my skin crawl. There was something awful about the way those words entered the space. Not loud, not angry, almost soft, which somehow made them worse. They didn't belong between a grown man and a 15-year-old girl, alone in a van that was no longer heading where she had asked. In that instant, every harmless explanation I had been clinging to collapsed. The missed turn was not a mistake. The conversation about his family was not simple friendliness. The atmosphere in the van changed completely, and I knew it. Then he suggested that I should let him take me out to eat. I remember the exact feeling of hearing that. It was not confusion anymore. It was recognition. This is bad. This is dangerous. This man is not taking me home. The world did not tilt gradually after that. It snapped. I told him no. I said I wanted to go home. What stays with me is how steady my voice sounded compared to how I felt inside. My body was in chaos, but some social instinct was still trying to keep everything controlled. I was polite. Firm, I think, but polite. That is how girls are trained. Don't provoke, don't escalate, stay calm, be nice enough to stay safe. It is a strange thing to notice later, how manners survive even inside fear. He laughed it off. Then he asked if I was hungry. He said we could get something to eat. He kept pressing, not in a dramatic way, but in a smooth, pushing way that was somehow worse because it made everything feel more deliberate. He was acting as if this was a conversation, as if I had a choice being offered to me, as if this was flirtation, not coercion. That kind of pressure is its own kind of trap. It tries to make the victim participate in the lie. I said no again. I asked to go home. I wanted my words to be clear without sounding confrontational. I wanted to refuse without angering him. I wanted more than anything to get out of that van alive and unhurt. And every decision I made in those minutes was shaped by that goal, whether I consciously knew it or not. Instead of turning around, he pulled into the back of an empty parking lot. That is one of the images that stayed with me most strongly. The way the van rolled farther and farther into a quiet, mostly dark area where there were no other cars and no people and no immediate witness to anything that might happen next. Parking lots are so ordinary in daylight, functional, forgettable, but empty at the wrong time. They feel like waiting spaces for bad things. The moment the van stopped, my whole body changed. Numb is the best word I have for it. It was as if all the fear that had been rushing through me became too much at once, and my system shut something down. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I could feel my heart beating in my ears, but my thoughts seemed to scatter. Fight, open the door, scream, run, stay calm. I could not organize any of it into action. I froze. That part used to embarrass me before I understood it better. At the time, and for a long time afterward, I hated that I had not immediately leaped for the door or shouted or done something bigger. But fear does not always work in clean, heroic ways. Sometimes the body stalls when danger feels too close and too real and too impossible to solve all at once. That is what happened to me in that parking lot. I wasn't choosing passivity. My body had simply gone into a kind of locked state, while my mind tried to catch up. Then he leaned over. He reached his arm around the back of my seat. That movement broke something in me. Maybe because it made the threat physical in a new way. Maybe because until then there had still been some tiny part of me pretending that words were all this was. But the second he leaned toward me, whatever had been frozen inside me shifted. I looked straight at him and said, "Take me home. Now." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My voice, from what I remember, was low and hard, harder than I had ever heard it before. I was not brave in any conscious, noble way. I did not feel strong. I felt terrified. But sometimes terror strips everything down to one necessary command. That sentence was the only thing left in me. For a second, he just looked at me. Those seconds stretched horribly. I had no idea what he was going to do. Agree, laugh, get angry, lock the doors, grab me. Every possibility seemed to exist at once. That pause was one of the longest moments of my life because it contained all the futures I was afraid of. Then he pulled out of the parking lot. The relief hit me so suddenly it almost hurt. But it was not real relief yet. Not the kind that lets your body soften. It was fragile, conditional, unstable. He was driving again, yes. But I was still in the van, still alone. Still with a man I now understood was willing to ignore what I wanted if he thought he could. I stayed tense the entire time. I watched the road. I watched him. I stayed ready to speak again if I had to. As we got closer to my neighborhood, he asked if he could have my number. I didn't answer. I stared out the window and pretended I hadn't heard him. I knew by then that any real engagement with him felt dangerous. I didn't want to give him anything. Not information, not friendliness, not a chance to keep me in conversation. Silence felt safer than refusal. When he got near my area, I did not tell him exactly where I lived. That choice came to me fast, but not from nowhere. By then I understood enough to know that getting home was not the only thing that mattered. If he knew my exact house, the danger might not end when I got out of the van, so I told him to let me off several roads away instead. He stopped. I got out, and even then, I didn't trust that it was over. There was an elderly couple's house nearby, and I walked toward it as if that were my home. I tried to move normally, calmly, as though I belonged there and had no reason to be afraid. I could feel the performance of it in every step. I was acting for him, trying to give him one final lie to carry away. This is where I live. This is where you can stop paying attention to me. This is the end of your access. I waited until the van drove away. Only then did I run. I didn't walk home by the road. I cut through the woods. I remember branches scraping my arms and clothes. I remember the burn in my lungs. I remember the panic pushing me forward faster than I thought I could move. The woods did not feel safe exactly, but they felt hidden, and hidden was enough. I wanted distance. I wanted unpredictability. I wanted to make myself hard to follow. The whole way home I felt as if the van might suddenly appear beside me, as if he might have circled back, as if not seeing him meant nothing. When I got inside the house, I locked the door immediately. That sound, the lock turning, was the first moment of real relief. My hands were shaking so badly that when I called my friends, I could barely hold the phone properly. I told them what had happened, or at least the parts I could say clearly. I remember the strange difficulty of speaking after fear. The body still acts as if the threat is present even when the words are trying to describe it as past tense. Their parents took it seriously right away. That matters to me more than I can fully explain. So many stories like this become worse because adults hesitate, minimize, question, or delay. But their parents believed me. They acted. They contacted the taxi company and reported what had happened. The man was fired almost immediately. Knowing that helped, but it did not undo anything. Consequences are not the same as safety. Even after I knew he had lost that job, my body did not relax. For months afterward, I stayed on edge. Every unfamiliar car made my stomach tighten. Every older van made me look twice. If I heard an engine slow near me, I felt fear before logic. I worried he might look for me. I worried he might be angry about being reported. I worried he might somehow know where I really lived, despite everything I had done to prevent that. Nothing else happened, but fear does not vanish just because the feared event fails to repeat itself. Once something has shown you how quickly normal life can turn, part of you goes on expecting that turn again. What frightened me most was not just what he did. It was how ordinary the whole situation had looked right up until it wasn't. That is the part that stayed with me longest. One minute I was just a girl going home from dance practice, sitting in a vehicle I had every reason to believe was part of a familiar routine. The next minute I was trapped in a van with a grown man who had decided to test how far he could take me from safety. There was no dramatic setup, no obvious villain, no scene that would have warned an outsider watching from far away. It all happened inside something every day. That is how a lot of danger works, especially for girls. It does not always arrive looking monstrous. Sometimes it arrives looking helpful, practical, familiar. It wears the shape of transportation, politeness, community routine. And by the time it reveals its real intention, you are already alone, already isolated, already calculating how to survive without making things worse. I think about that 15-year-old version of me sometimes. She was trying to be polite, trying not to overreact, trying to trust that adults would behave like adults, and that routines meant safety. She wanted to be reasonable. She wanted not to seem paranoid. She was still living in that early stage of girlhood where you are taught to manage everyone else's comfort, even when your own instincts are screaming. I wish I could go back and tell her a few things. I would tell her that fear does not need permission to be valid, that noticing something is wrong is not the same as being rude, that an adult who ignores your direction, isolates you, comments on your body, and pressures you after you say no is not being friendly. He is being dangerous. I would tell her that the moment in the parking lot when she found her voice mattered, that saying, "Take me home, now," probably changed the rest of her life, because I believe that. I do not know exactly what would have happened if I had stayed quiet longer. I do not know whether he would have kept pushing with words, or moved further physically, or tried to trap me in some more direct way. The not knowing is part of what remains frightening, but I know enough. I know that he ignored my direction. I know that he isolated me. I know that he took me to an empty parking lot instead of my home. I know that he leaned toward me, and I know that after I finally spoke with force, he changed course. That matters. Even now, telling the story feels important to me, not because it is dramatic, but because it is real. It is the kind of thing that happens quietly, in broad daylight or near it, in ordinary towns, after ordinary activities, to people who are not reckless, not foolish, not looking for trouble. It happens to girls trying to get home. It happens in places that have already begun to feel normal. It happens inside routines that have worked many times before. And sometimes survival looks very simple from the outside. A girl gets out of a van, walks away, makes it home. But inside that simple outline, there is a whole world of fear, calculation, instinct, and luck. That is what I remember most now. Not just the danger, but the thinness of the line between ordinary and irreversible, and the strange, hard little voice that appeared in me when I needed it most.